You know, they tell you not to pick up hitchhikers, and when I was younger, I always thought that was a very cynical way to view people, assuming that they were inherently up to no good. However, as an adult, and having had experienced something almost terrible happen to me in one of the most unforeseen ways, I'm certainly wary of roadside travelers. You see, I was driving down the road about 5 years ago, and it wasn't on the highway or anything, but the speed limit was 45, which to someone standing still is pretty fast. As I was making my way down the road, I noticed an older woman standing along the side of the road. She looked to be around 50 years old, and in her arms, she was cradling what looked like a blue blanket. So immediately I assumed it was a mother and her child stranded on the side of the road. I decided to pull up to the woman and ask her if everything was okay, and that was when she told me that her ex-husband had kicked her and her baby out on the side of the road after the two had an argument. So I asked if I could help in any way, and she asked if it wouldn't be too much trouble on my part to give her a ride to town, which was only about 2 miles away. I figured it was no problem. The only issue was that I didn't have a car seat for the baby, though she assured me that since it was such a short ride, she would hold him in her arms as long as I drove slow and safely. So she hopped in the car and we were off, and about a minute into the drive, I couldn't help but notice that she hadn't taken her eyes off of me. It was like she was staring daggers into my head, and when I finally turned to face her, I noticed that she had put the blanket down on her lap. It was empty. She hadn't been carrying a child at all. Instead, in her right hand, she was now wielding a small knife of sorts. As soon as my eye line went toward the knife, the woman began to get very aggressive. She began yelling at me, but I couldn't make out a single word that she was saying. I begged her to please calm down. Just tell me what she wanted. All I can really remember is asking her not to hurt me. This was when she pushed the knife lightly against the side of my neck and told me not to try anything. All she wanted was my car and my phone, and then everything would be okay. She told me to slowly pull over, and I complied without question. I was fully prepared to give her my car. I knew that my life was worth more than my belongings. But then she made a mistake I would have never expected her to make. After I put the car in park, instead of forcing me out of the car and then hopping into the driver's seat herself, the woman with the knife unlocked her door and got out of the car. She told me to stay there, and she began to walk around to the driver's side. I saw the opportunity and threw my car in reverse. I pushed the gas down just enough to gain traction, and then I forced it into reverse. Once I was about 100 feet down the road from the woman, I put the car back into drive and sped past her as fast as I could. After I got back to my house, I notified the police, and they said they would look into the situation. But other than that, I haven't heard anything. All I know is that looks can be deceiving. I thought I was helping an innocent woman and her child, but in reality, I almost became a victim. It was 1975, and around that time, it wasn't uncommon to find someone who was walking alongside of the road looking for a ride. Sometimes it was a short distance. Other times, people were making their way across the country. I happened to be driving back from a small trip that I took during summer vacation, and I was a few hours away from home. The route that I plotted out for myself on the map was taking me through a series of back roads at the moment. It was a nice little scenic road with lots of trees, so driving along listening to some tunes was pretty peaceful. And as I was chugging along, I thought I could see something on the side of the road in the distance. I thought it might be a deer or something, so I began to slow down. And as I got closer, it was unmistakably a young man. He didn't seem like he was out to hurt anyone, so I decided to slow down and see if he needed a ride in the direction I was heading. Without hesitation, the man, who seemed very grateful, said that he would go as far as I would be willing to take him, and I didn't question it. I figured I could drop him off at a truck stop or something, and he could get to his destination from there. So we hopped in and we took off, and at first it was great to have someone to talk to. We jammed out to some music and things were a blast. Then out of nowhere, I could feel him get a little tense, and he began to lower himself in his seat a bit. That's when I saw it, a sign that said, "Warning, hitchhikers might be escaped convicts." And sure enough, after making it past a group of trees, I could see a large sign and a gate for a prison to my right. My new passenger must have seen me notice it, because right then he said, "Just keep driving." I listened to all his instructions, which ended up leading us off the back road and down a small trail about 5 miles away from the prison. It was there that he forced me out of the car, and instead of just driving away, he followed me, picked something up off the ground, and then swung it at my head. The next thing I remember is waking up. It was sunrise at that point. I was still on the trail, but my car and the young man were long gone. I never saw that car or the person again. It turned out that he was indeed a prisoner who had escaped that night. He stole clothes from a guard's locker somehow and managed to pull himself off as just a random person looking for a ride. He was apparently incarcerated for manslaughter, so I count myself as lucky to be alive.
If you really like my content and want to support me, please like this video and click the subscribe button. It helps me to grow my channel, as essential in reaching a wider audience. Most of you watching my videos aren't subscribed to my channel, and that's why my animations can't reach their full potential. They aren't recommended to more people who would surely love my content as much as you do. You can always unsubscribe at any moment. Thank you in advance, and enjoy the rest of the video.
It was 2002, and I decided that it was time for me to make something of myself. However, I always had a tendency to backtrack on my goals. Something that a lot of people told me was that I never give myself time to relax. So I was going to take the year off and travel across the country. I had saved up some money from the years of working, and I did the math. If I spent my money sparingly and I picked up some odd jobs along the way, I should have been more than capable of lasting the year on what I had saved. My plan was simple. I took a flight from Chicago to New York, and from there, I would travel around each state to see what the rest of the country had to offer outside of my small hometown. Things started off really well. For the first few weeks, I traveled via bus or train from city to city, enjoying as much as I could while remaining on my budget. Something I quickly found out, that it was fairly hard to snag a quick, paying job in a town you were only going to be in for a day or two. This meant that I would have to figure out a way to save a bit of money, and to be honest, I probably went about the situation the wrong way, because for some reason, the best way I could think of to save money would be if I could find a cheaper way to travel. That was when I decided to try my hand at hitchhiking. Excuse the pun. I walked along the side of a highway in Virginia for about 45 minutes, alternating between which hand I was using to attempt to flag someone down. And finally, I was happy to see a small 2-door sedan slowly pull off. As I approached the passenger side door, I noticed that it was only the driver in the car. He seemed like a clean-cut and older gentleman who had no facial hair, but wore circular glasses like Lenin. He asked where I was heading, and I explained to him that any town with a cheap place to stay would be great, and he said he could drop me off in a city about 10 miles away, which sounded amazing at the time. So I thanked him graciously and hopped into the passenger seat of his car. At first, things seemed like they were going great, and it turned out that he apparently grew up not too far from me, or at least that's what he told me. Maybe he was just trying to get me to lower my guard. After we passed an off-ramp that I thought was going to take us to the city he told me about, I asked him how far away we are, and his answer was one that I never wanted to hear. He said, "We're about 3 hours away from your new home." I was confused. I began to chuckle a bit, hoping that it was some weird joke that I didn't understand. That was when I saw him press the switch to lock the doors. "What are you doing?" I asked. That's when I saw him pull a gun out from the panel of his door. He pointed the handgun in my direction and told me to just relax. And I don't know what came over me, but I knew I had to do something. I reached for the gun in hopes of either getting it from him or distracting him enough to crash his car, but he was quicker. I didn't feel the bullet hit me, but the ringing in my ears was enough to make me almost pass out. The stranger that I had entrusted had just shot me. We drove for a little while longer. I couldn't bring myself to speak. I was so dazed by the situation. The bullet had entered in the left side of my chest. I felt my eyes growing heavy, and I could hear him muttering to himself. Everything after that came to me in pieces. I vaguely remember pulling off of the highway. Then we were in the woods. I was pulled from the car and left lying next to a tree. I'll never forget the relief it felt when I heard his tires skid as he pulled away. I think he thought I was dead or going to die. Hell, I did too. Lucky for me, I still had my phone. I was able to call emergency services. It took them some time to find me, and by the time they got there, I had already passed out, assuming I would never wake up again. Thankfully, I did. I woke up in the ambulance where I was told that I was going to be fine, and they were taking me to the hospital. Apparently, the bullet went in and out, meaning that it went on a straight path and didn't bounce around or break up inside of me, causing massive internal damage. I ended my trip then and there, and once I was able to fly home, I did. My friends always told me I was too trusting of strangers. Not anymore.
This story took place when I was 23 years old, close to 10 years ago. I was living in upstate New York in a very rural area with my ex-boyfriend and his family. He and I used to argue quite a bit, and one morning before he went to work, he and I got into a very heated argument. He was 20 years my senior, but during this particular fight, he acted majorly juvenile. He jumped out of bed, flipped me the bird, and yelled, "If you don't like it so much, then why don't you go back to the Bronx?" That was all the prompting I needed. I threw on my Uggs and my winter jacket, grabbed my cigarettes, and flew out of the house. I am unfortunately an impulsive idiot and didn't think to grab my cell phone before I stormed out. I didn't drive, so my only option was to walk. I don't think at the time that I intended to walk back to the Bronx, as I was a 3-hour car ride upstate, but I just needed to go for an angry, dramatic walk. I realized once I got to this road at the entrance of the trailer park that I had no idea where anything really was around me, as I had only lived there for a few months at that point, and we really didn't go out a lot. I banked left and just walked and walked where I knew civilization was. I found myself walking alongside a very busy stretch of road with 18-wheelers flying by, spraying me with slushy snow and soaking my shoes. I saw my then-boyfriend driving by on his way to work, and he sped up as he drove past me, evidently still angry about our fight. I thought for sure he was going to turn around at some point, but he never came back. I pressed on, deciding instead to try to walk to my best friend's mother's house, which I knew to be in the same town. It started to snow, and I was losing momentum. I passed by a VFW where a nondescript pickup truck was parked in the driveway. It wasn't until I had passed it that I even realized the driver was in the front seat. He called out to me,
Hey, honey, do you need help? My stomach churned, realizing I would have to accept this stranger's offer. I approached his truck slowly and tried to weigh out my options. He was a clean-cut, seemingly normal older white guy. Gray hair, greenish-blue eyes, just average. I blurted out, "Are you a good guy or bad guy?" And cringed at myself for asking such a dumb question. He answered, "I'm a good guy. I wouldn't tell you if I was a bad guy, would I?" I ignored the bells going off in my head and got in the front seat with him. As we drove, I realized I had no clue where my friend's mom actually lived. I knew the name of the road she lived on, but it spanned a good distance, so it wasn't very helpful in terms of finding my destination. I asked to borrow his cell phone so I could try calling my best friend to ask where I was going. I called her 3 times and she didn't answer because she didn't recognize the number. I started to feel inexplicably hopeless. After a few minutes, he asked me where I was from and why I was out in the middle of nowhere in the snow wearing pajamas. I explained I was originally from the Bronx and that I had gotten into a fight with my boyfriend. He paused and said, "Hey, you wouldn't be interested in making a little money, would you?" I chuckled nervously and said, "Oh, no thanks, though." He responded, "Well, I just figured since you said you were from the Bronx," and trailed off. Realizing at that point I was almost definitely in deep doo-doo, I muttered, "Oh, sure. He eyed me up and down and laughed to himself before sneering. Sure, she says. I started to panic big time, but knew I couldn't show my fear. I scoured the scenery for a pillowy snowbank that I could land in if I leapt out of the truck, to no avail. The houses were so few and far in between, I became certain this would be how I met my demise. I'll never know why, but it was at this point that he decided to ask me who I was going to see. I quickly blurted out my best friend's mom's name and her husband's full name. He instantly perked up and explained that he knew the husband and how they used to snowmobile together 20 years ago. I felt the greatest wave of relief when he explained that he knew exactly where his old buddy lived. When we finally pulled up to that big yellow house, it was like arriving to the promised land. I sheepishly asked his name. "Steve," he said, and then asked mine. I gave him a fake name, spat out a nonsense thank you, and ran as fast as I could from his truck to the porch. I crashed through the front door and locked it behind me. I immediately start crying and running through the house trying to find my friend's mom. I had awoken her from a sound sleep, but she didn't say a word about it upon seeing how shaken up I was. Once I knew I was safe with her, I explained everything. The fight, the fleeing, the weird guy and his proposition, and she listened, horrified and curious at the same time. She made me promise to never do anything so reckless again, and that if I ever needed her, to call her. She told me she would ask her husband when he got home about this Steve guy and find out more about him. I returned to my boyfriend's later that same day and got really stoned and tried to forget about the events of that morning. The following day, my friend's mom called me to tell me that Steve was a dangerous person who her husband had cut off communication with years ago. The last he had heard about Steve was that he had been arrested for assault. She then went on to point out how incredibly easy it would have been for him to hurt me and leave me just about anywhere on some lonely stretch of road, and no one would even know where to look for me. Not to mention, I might not even been found until the snow thawed out. One of the worst nights of my life was December 28th, 2013. To put it bluntly, and in as few words as possible, a tough Christmas had been rough on my mental health. Then a straight-up shouting match with my mom just kind of finished me off. I stormed out of our family home, screaming profanity and swearing that they'd never see me again. Yep, I was that petulant teenager. Sure, I'd forgotten my phone and wallet, but was I way too proud to go back and get them? You bet I was. So in my fit of only partially warranted rage, I somehow decided it would be a good idea to try to hitchhike to my friend's house so I could stay the night there. I'd never hitchhiked before. I don't think I'd even held my thumb out for a cab at this point in my life. But there I was, stood on a stretch of Florida highway trying to catch the attention of a passing driver. To my surprise, someone actually pulled over pretty quickly, and not the hippie bus rust bucket I've been visualizing either. It was one of those high-end Chevys, I'm not sure which model, and the guy behind the wheel looked like he had a few dollars. I mean, he was the archetypical rich dad type. Absolutely nothing to indicate that he was anything but nice and well-meaning. "Hop in," he calls out from the open passenger window. I couldn't believe my luck. Like, not only was I about to actually hitchhike for the first time, which felt pretty cool, not gonna lie, but I was about to do it in style. I can't tell the difference between faux leather and the real deal, but when you're in an air-conditioned sedan that still has that new car smell at 17, who cares? You feel as grown up as you can. So the guy asked me why I'm hitchhiking, and I'll be honest. I may have given him a totally hopped-up version of events which totally made me out to be the victim. Abusive parents, poor me, blah blah blah. Naturally, he takes this as gospel and starts telling me how his father was an alcoholic, how he sympathized with my situation. I asked him to take me as far down the road as he could, and that I had a friend that lived about 30 minutes drive away. He says cool, and down the highway we go. As he's driving, we talk a lot more about family. He pops the glove box and boom, there's a picture of his kids. As I'm looking at his little girls, he starts telling me how important he thinks family is, especially to those of us that come from less than stable backgrounds. Then he said something that seemed completely out of character. We're pulling into a gas station after he mentions needing to fill up, continuing the family convo in segments, if that makes any sense. 1 minute he'll stop talking because he needs to focus on a turn or a lane switch, then he carries on. So it was almost out of nowhere when he says something like, "We have to protect our families from our true natures." I didn't know what to say to that. Not in the moment, so I just kind of stayed quiet as he gets out of the car and starts filling up the tank. I had a few minutes to process those words, and the more I thought about them, the more I realized that hitchhiking might not have been such a good idea. When he gets back in after paying for the gas, there's a few moments of quiet as I'm still trying to work out just what he meant by his last statement. So I just asked. I straight up asked him what he meant by something so ominous. "It'll be easier if I show you." Ever wonder what it would feel like to tuck and roll out of a moving vehicle? Ever try to imagine it because you're literally about to do it and you're pretty sure it'd kill you at the speeds you're traveling? Probably not. I hadn't. Not until that moment right there. But somehow I convinced myself that I was just being overly dramatic. Too little too late, huh? So I just stayed in the car. I didn't even ask for him to pull over or anything. Christ, looking back at it, I wasn't sure what was going through my head at all. Just that I really didn't want to be around this guy anymore. He'd gone from nice and normal to moody and creepy in light speed. You know, everyone has secrets. He says after pulling into a dark commercial lot and shutting the engine off. So imagine that line spoken as creepily as you can imagine, then double it, and that's what this guy sounded like. I kept my tone polite up until that point, like I needed this dude to get to my friend's house, but I was all out of cool by then, and I'm literally about to ask him what he's talking about, when he puts his hand on my thigh. Doesn't just put it there, he puts his hand there and squeezes. Little side note here, I am not in the least bit homophobic. An older cousin of mine came out as gay long before this ever happened, and aside from a great uncle whose mentality seems to be firmly rooted in the 1920s, everyone in the family just accepted him for who he is. So this isn't me like, oh god, it was scary because a gay dude touched me, because really I don't think this guy was even gay. Like I said, he had pictures of his kid, mentioned his wife, even complained about his in-laws a little during our little family talk. Not that that rules out him being in the closet. Look, what I'm trying to say is, he did what he did because he was a predator. He saw someone vulnerable, He apparently had a rough childhood or family background and saw someone he could manipulate. It was the look in his eyes, man. Not this vulnerable I like you look. It was like a hunger. That's the only way I can describe it. Like an excitement before a feast. I just hit him. I'm not some tough guy. I don't do MMA. I don't think I've even landed the punch properly, but I threw it hard enough to let him know that he was not about to have his way with me in a dark parking lot in the middle of winter. Then I tried to undo my seatbelt. Tried being the operative word. I pushed the little red button and absolutely nothing happened. No clicking or catching of mechanisms, nothing. You should have seen this guy smile when that happened. I will never, ever forget that look in his eye. Pure predator. I'm not even ashamed to admit that I started screaming for help like a little kid. But ever have a nightmare where you try to scream but your voice keeps kinda catching in your throat? It's so scary because it can literally happen. And it happened to me, right there in that dark parking lot. I'm not even entirely sure what happened next. I remember slamming my fist into the glass window and it popping all over me. I know I must have gotten the door open somehow, too. There were headlights behind us, someone shouting as they intervened. The predatory driver reached under his seat, and I thought for a moment that he was about to pull out a gun or something. But then the seatbelt felt kind of loose, so I just kind of rolled out of the car as it sped away. In retrospect, I think the guy had a way to unbuckle it like jury-rigged under his seat, if that makes any sense. I mean, it was incredibly tight, and then it just wasn't. Then the cops are there. My rescuer must have called, and I'm just numb. Not only because I couldn't believe I'd almost gotten myself kidnapped or whatever. I mean, I have no idea what that guy was planning for me, other than it wasn't good or innocent. But it was the fact that my own foolish pride, my own self-pity and lies, could have been the things really responsible for what could have easily happened, an untimely death.
When I was 17, I didn't have a driver's license. Most of the time I walked or hitchhike. There was this one night. There weren't that many cars on the road, and it was very cold. And this man pulled over. When the guy pulled over, I took a good look at the guy and figured I could take him if he tried anything. He was on the slender side and had a strange frailness about him, even though he looked healthy enough. I got into the car after we agreed on the destination. We exchanged names and I warmed my fingers up in front of the heating vent. He spoke quietly, asking a few questions along the lines of, was I local and how did I like living there? He said he only been here for a few months, but found it beautiful and hoped he could find happiness there. That comment struck me as a little odd, but I brushed it off. It began to snow and the road quickly got slippery. So he slowed and he kept his eyes straight out the windshield, driving silently. I was okay with that, as small talk was never my forte. About 10 minutes later, I noticed the car near the intersection we were approaching seemed to be sliding, so I said, "Watch out." He immediately hit the gas, shooting through the intersection and burst out with, "Don't ever scream at me." Needless to say, I was taken aback. I said, "Look, this is close enough. Just pull over here and I can get there." He didn't seem to hear me. So I said, "Richard, did you hear me? I said you can pull over here and let me out." But no response. He just stared straight ahead, driving faster now than he did when it started snowing. To say I was scared doesn't seem to cover the depth of the fear that began to rise in me. I didn't know if I should stay quiet or speak, but I was damn sure not going to yell after his outburst. After about a mile, he began to mumble under his breath. I couldn't quite make out what he was saying, but I assumed he was speaking to me. So I said, "What did you say? I couldn't hear you." He began to speak quietly and rapidly, saying things like, "You're always yelling at me. I've told you time and time again, do not yell at me. I don't appreciate it. No, you don't listen, you don't listen." And I was just sitting there looking at him. I was at a complete loss. I didn't know what to say in response or if I should say anything at all. I contemplated just jumping out of the car, but nixed that idea when I realized the door lock was missing. There was just a silver-lined hole where it should have been. I started to cry and debate with myself about causing an accident by grabbing the wheel and hoping for the best, when he suddenly looked at me for the first time since I had gotten in the car. He blinked several times, rapidly, then slowed the car, pulling into a gas station. I waited to see if he unlocked the doors, not wanting to say anything to set him off again. After a minute or two, he quietly said, "I think I better let you out of here." And he hit the button to the door locks, and he opened the door. I wasn't about to hesitate, so I jumped out of the car as if I were on fire. I was about to turn and walk into the gas station when he called my name. He looked so damn sad and I hesitated. He apologized, said he was sorry if he had frightened me, that he never would have harmed me. And he asked if I'd be able to get home okay. I said I would and closed the door. He began to pull out of the gas station, but stopped suddenly. He just sat there for a couple of moments, his head down. I froze, wondering what the hell was up, and was about to run into the gas station, but he opened his window and yelled at me, waving something in his hand, my hat. I left it on his seat. I slowly approached the side of his car, and he handed it to me, apologizing again. I didn't know what else to say, so I just said, "Thanks." I watched as he drove off, making sure he was out of sight before moving on so he wouldn't know which direction I was heading. As I walked, I went to put my hat back on, and a piece of paper fell out of it. Folded into a paper was a $100 bill. The paper said, "I'm sorry. Please take a cab and don't hitchhike anymore tonight." I didn't. In fact, it was the last time I ever hitchhiked in my life. Will never, ever do that again.